Welcome back YouTube. Today we're going to go through working out how many reps you want to be doing within your workout and the exercises within that workout. Now this is something that a lot of people can find quite complicated or maybe overcomplicate it, when in reality it can be pretty straightforward. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through now a couple of things we need to take into consideration when it comes to giving certain exercises within our workout a given rep range. Don't forget, if you do enjoy the video, please do drop a like. Drop a comment if you've got any questions. If you haven't already, please do subscribe. Okay, so the first probably big mistake people make when it comes to rep ranges is that they think there's a magic rep range, right? And that when they found this magic rep range, every exercise then has to stay within that rep range, in that given rep range, okay? Which isn't the case. There isn't a magic rep range. And in reality, it actually might be the opposite that we're after, and we might want a little bit of variety, okay? Now when I talk about rep ranges, in this instance, I'm talking about rep ranges for adding muscle mass or retaining muscle mass, you know, for someone who's wanting to try and change their sort of physique, their body shape, which therefore requires the addition or the retention of muscle mass, okay? That's what we're talking about here in this scenario. So the first one is exactly that, variation, okay? Again, there isn't a magic rep range. And in fact, there's a different range of rep ranges that are actually going to be beneficial for the addition of muscle mass and therefore the retention of muscle mass. Okay, so for me personally, the range that I would work within would be anywhere between like 5 reps to anywhere maybe like 25-30. This rep range of 5 to 25/30 is a decent number for a couple of reasons. One, looking at the lower end. 5 reps is a decent number for one, still creating somewhat of a decent stimulus for our muscles, but two, also being a decent indicator of strength, right? So maybe, you know, if you're seeing some movements over the course of weeks, strength rising within a lower rep range, that's typically a good indicator that one, strength's increasing, and therefore two, if you're doing everything else alongside it, muscle mass is probably being added as well, right? So it gives us that sort of good indicator, but it's still a decent rep range where you're still going to be giving some sort of a stimulus rather than say a 1 rep max, where you're not really going to be getting too much of an actual stimulus worthy of adding muscle mass. Now on the other hand, going up to like 25-30 reps, again at that rep range you're giving again a stimulus that's going to be decent for adding muscle mass. You're creating quite a lot of stress for the muscle at that point. But then we'll also be careful of going that too far potentially. Maybe, you know, especially frequently, probably not wanting to go too far further past that sort of 25-30, because essentially at that point you are just accumulating a lot of fatigue within that muscle. And if we're doing that quite frequently, quite a lot, that potentially might have negative knock-on effects towards the recovery of that muscle, or maybe in that session getting more out of it, right? Just because the accumulation of fatigue and those sort of byproducts when we're accumulating that much stress within the muscle. So if you're using varied rep ranges across exercises, across your sessions within this range, that's going to be a good starting point and something you want to look at. Now you have to then consider, well, what rep ranges do I use on which movements? I'm going to talk through that now in a bit more detail. So, deciding what rep range you use for certain movements. I'm going to have this sort of debate of compound versus isolation movements. Now, that's just a phase that people like to use compound movements, where that movement might be using like more than one joint movement, you know, basically movements that require a lot more creating stability, a lot more going on essentially in comparison to isolation movements where you're maybe like locked into a machine, only one joint's working. Let's say, for example, like a leg extension would be an isolation in comparison to like a squat or something. Now, you know, people will argue that isolation movements are never isolation movements because, you know, it's not just really your knee joint that's working. You know, you've got to keep everything like core braced and lock yourself in, pull yourself into the machine. We're not going to get into that right now, but just to sort of break this down to have an idea of what we're talking about and what rep ranges we might use on what exercises, let's just think of it as sort of almost compound versus isolation, right? Let's say to try and dumb it down even more complicated movements versus simpler movements, right? Now it might be a good idea on isolation movements where, again, let's say it's typically safer because you can lock yourself in, you can keep things a lot more stable and therefore keep form execution pretty solid for a good amount of time. It might make more sense to typically use a higher rep range on those movements, okay? Whereas on the compound movements, it might make more sense on them to use a lower rep range, okay? Where we're shifting more weight, but they also might be a good movement for shifting a lot of weight, okay? So for example, a squat, let's take a squat for example. If you've got a squat in your program, or a deadlift, something like that, they're typically quite good movements where you're going to shift quite a lot of weight. And in that sense, it would maybe then make sense to use the majority of that movement for that lower rep range, okay, where you can focus on it for maybe primarily building strength, but still creating that good stimulus. And you're not potentially taking the rep range too high where you're building a lot of fatigue and, you know, concerned about that breakdown of that movement. So as an example, you know, you might be looking at these movements, isolation movements, be thinking somewhere between like the 10 to 25 range, the compound movements somewhere between like the 5 and 12. This is just an example, and again, there isn't exact numbers with this, okay? So, for example, you know, I quite often will have my bigger movements, let's say like the compound movements, bigger movements at the beginning of a session, and I will normally have them with a lower rep range, let's say 5 to 8. And then going through the session, I might move into movements that are more isolation based, and I might move into more of like a 8 to 12 rep range, right? And then I might have more exercises moving on that might go through a, you know, 15 to 20 rep range, and so forth. Okay, but the variation's there, and my thought process in it mainly is which rep ranges are going to probably be more beneficial and safe for that exercise. When we're, again, for that exercise, focusing on what we can get out of that exercise, the amount of weight we can potentially shift, form and execution, how safe it is, and the fatigue that movement's going to build. Okay, then the last little one to talk about, because again, you can play around with things quite a lot here, and in a sense, when it comes to reps, you've got quite a lot of freedom to almost kind of do what you want, okay? Like I said, again, there's no set number, there isn't a set way you would need to do things, essentially. And one thing you can look at is actually variation within reps, within sets of the same movement. So you might have heard of this idea of a top set and like a back off set, right? And typically in a top set, you would do more weight and less reps. So let's say like a 5 to 8 set, okay? 5 to 8 reps, obviously you're shifting more weight. And then you might do a back off set where you drop the weight like 20-30%, but you're hitting more reps. So you might drop the weight and then hit like a 12 to 15 rep range, okay? And essentially what that's doing is creating two different challenges where you're basically creating almost two different ways of trying to create that stimulus for that muscle, okay, within this, you know, variety of rep ranges. So this can just be another way of, again, creating variety of reps within different sets, okay? So it doesn't have to be one exercise has to have this rep range. It can also differ within the exercise. But again, there isn't a certain or special rep range that's going to work best for you. There's a variety of reps that you can use to get the adaptation that you're after. It's just you coming to the conclusion of where those rep ranges might best fit and why. But again, you know, you've got quite a bit of freedom in terms of the decision you make there. Hopefully this video has helped you, you know, come to an idea of what rep ranges you're going to use and where you might use them. Again, you know, if there's any confusion here or you've still got more questions on which movements you might want to use, which reps you might want to use in a given movement, then by all means drop them in the comments. I can get back to you. But if you did find this video helpful, please do drop a like. And don't forget to subscribe. I'm also going to be walking through in the next video how many sets you potentially want to be programming for your own training. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.